Well, hey there, friends. I'm your host, Penny, and this is Criminally Nerdy. Hello and welcome back, you beautiful bunch. I hope everyone had a fun weekend. I had an absolute blast at the Pride Festival, and it was so wonderful getting to meet some of you lovelies. Thanks to everyone who showed support by rocking their Criminally Nerdy podcast shirts and stickers. The only downside is I'm behind schedule and tired. My old ass cannot deal with a day filled with walking. There's just no way. In podcast news, I wanted to share an update with you all. Robert Pickton, the pig farm killer we discussed in episode 13, has died from his injuries. Can't say I'll be losing any sleep over that one. Not much else going on right now, but I might have some news in the next couple of weeks as far as listener involvement goes, so keep an ear out. In the meantime, please keep telling all of your true crime loving friends and family about the show because my advertising budget consists of word of mouth. So, and of course, you folks are the greatest, and I just love you bunches and bunches. This episode is airing on June 10th, which is comedian Bill Burr's birthday. Happy birthday, Bill! On top of it being National Pet Wedding Week, today is Egg Roll Day, Black Cow, which is another name for a root beer float, Day, and National Bay Day. Sounds like a damn good day to call into work. Grab your bay and go get some egg rolls and root beer floats. Probably not at the same time though, because that sounds awful. Top your day off by putting your cat in a wedding dress and making her marry your dog. I guarantee your boss will be more worried about your sanity than your attendance when you come in tomorrow showing off pictures of your dog and cat getting married in the living room. The case I have for you today is of a man who made quite possibly the most disturbing New Year's resolution in history. In 1993, he made the decision that he was going to become a serial killer who targeted a very specific population. His efforts to emulate those he had read about and seen on TV took the most twisted of turns and struck fear into the heart of London's gay community during his summer spree. This is the case of Colin Ireland, also known as the Gay Slayer. That could be a cool band name, but no, it got wasted on this dick face. Some of my sources for this case were the True Gay Crime podcast, the Yorkshire Live, the TV show Born to Kill did an episode on this case, and the book The Gay Slayer by Fergus Mason. This case takes place in England, so I'm apologizing now for anything I may and most likely will mispronounce. On March 10th, 1993, the caretaker of a block of flats in Battersea heard dogs barking in one of the units, which was very odd. He knew the tenant, Mr. Walker, was over the moon for his dogs, a black lab and a German shepherd. There was no way he would let them go on barking for so long without getting to the bottom of what was wrong with them. Concerned, he knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He knocked again. Still no answer. The caretaker decided to open the door and check on him since this was so out of the ordinary. The dogs heard the door open and started barking even louder. It was clear that they were locked in another room, but the caretaker wasn't going any further into the apartment. One glance around the ransacked flat made it clear that he needed to call police immediately. Detective Martin Finnegan arrived on the scene. The apartment had clearly been robbed. Drawers were pulled out and either dumped on the floor or had their contents just strewn about. The detective moved forward toward the bedroom and could sense that nothing good was waiting for him inside. In the bedroom lay the body of 45-year-old director and choreographer Peter Walker. The only thing visible of the body were his feet. The rest of him had been covered with a blanket. 2 teddy bears were arranged in the 69 position and placed on top of him. Once they removed the blanket, they were met with a savagely beaten body. He had lash marks from a whip crisscrossing his chest and abdomen, along with multiple bruises. There were ligature marks from where he had been bound, but there were no restraints to be seen. He had been gagged with a knotted condom and had another condom stretched over his nose. The autopsy would later reveal that Peter had ultimately died from asphyxiation. Detective Finnegan knew that they were not dealing with a normal, everyday murder, if murder can be normal. They were dealing with a seriously deranged killer. While the forensic team was beginning their investigation, 2 other people were getting some pretty strange calls. The Samaritans, founded in 1952 to provide sex education and suicide prevention, got a call around 5 p.m. letting them know that there were dogs that had been locked in a flat for 2 days. They were confused because this is not a hotline for animal welfare. The caller became agitated and told the volunteer that the owner of the dogs was dead and that he had killed him before hanging up. Within minutes, the Samaritans were on the phone with the Battersea police to let them know. Detective Finnegan suspected that it was called in because the killer was concerned that the murder had not been discovered yet. However, it wasn't out of concern for the dogs being locked in a room. Not even an hour later, his call to the Sun would reveal the true motivation behind the killer's concern. Brandon Malinsky, a reporter for the Sun, was the one to take the call. The man on the other end sounded very normal at first, talking about 2 dogs that were locked in a flat. Brandon kept telling him that this wasn't a newsworthy story. He then drops the bombshell that the dogs were locked away because the caller had killed their owner. He also told Brandon that he had, quote, trussed him up like a chicken. Brandon was able to get the killer talking, during which time he told the reporter that he had made a New Year's resolution that he was going to become a serial killer and he wanted to be famous. Being a serial killer is not #goals, bro. Brandon reported the call to the police, which confirmed Detective Finnegan's suspicions. This kill wasn't a one-off. He didn't know if it had been his first, but it wouldn't be his last. They needed to catch this man, and fast. Unfortunately, the killer had wiped Peter Walker's flat clean. They had no shred of evidence to help move the case forward. What kind of cold, calculated monster could they be dealing with? Colin Ireland was born March 16, 1954, in Dartford, Kent, England. He was born to 17-year-old mother Pat Williams. Colin's biological father left when he found out about the pregnancy, so Colin never knew who his father was. This was at a time when having a child out of wedlock was looked down upon by the local community, making it quite the struggle to be a young unwed mother. To add to the stress, jobs were scarce in Kent in the 1960s, so many people commuted to London for work. His mother moved back in with her parents in Dartford after he was born. She wanted very much to give Colin the life he deserved, so she struck out on her own. But it was more difficult than she had imagined. She worked odd jobs, which she never kept for very long. Having no steady income forced them to move around a lot. I've seen nothing to suggest she was ever abusive to Colin, but she was at the very least negligent. One day, young Colin came home from school and found that his mother had just up and moved in the middle of the day. Neighbors tracked her down and reunited them, but it wasn't the happiest of reunions. It was dysfunctional at best. She was a young, single parent who was poorly educated and had no concept of the enormity of the responsibility that came along with being a parent. As a child, he was picked on a lot, being teased by his peers for being a skinny runt. That didn't last long, though. By the time he dropped out of school at the age of 13, he had started to pick up height and muscle. By the age of 15, he decided he wanted to leave for London. He was caught stealing money in an attempt to fund his getaway, so in 1970 he was sent to a rehabilitation school for troubled boys named Finchton Manor. While there, he was bullied by several other boys. Knowing he couldn't take them all on at once, he decided he would simply send a message. He singled out one of the ringleaders, heaped all of the boys' belongings into a pile, and set them on fire. Yeah, that might get someone's attention. He was expelled and put in the care of social services. Having no intention of being placed anywhere else, he carried out with his original plan and fled to London. He was 16 when he arrived, penniless and homeless. He began hanging around the Playland Arcade in Piccadilly Circus. It was known as a place where boys could go and pick up odd jobs, which sometimes included sex work, so it attracted people who would prey on young boys. Colin would later recall that he had been approached by an older man, but he wasn't interested, and the interaction spooked him. He resorted to stealing again to get by. In 1971, he was caught and charged for robbing a home. This being the second and more serious offense, he was sent to a borstal, or what we would call a youth detention center, called Hollesley Bay in Suffolk, which was an open borstal for juvenile offenders who were determined to be a low risk of escape. Who the fuck did that assessment? So Colin quickly escaped and fled into the Suffolk countryside. However, it was a rural agricultural area, so an unknown teenager skulking about was pretty noticeable. He was picked up within days, and they determined that he needed to be somewhere more secure. He was sent to a borstal in Rochester before transferring to one in Grendon, where he stayed until he was released at the age of 18 in 1972. He spent the next few years picking up odd jobs and drifting through South London. His old ways weren't behind him, so he was once again caught for theft at the age of 21. He was convicted of burglary, property damage, and car theft. He was sentenced to 18 months at an adult corrections center, but due to overcrowding, was released after only a year in November of 1978. He ended up in Swindon, about 60 miles west of London. It was here where he started his first relationship with a woman 5 years older than he was, who had 4 children. The relationship got pretty serious pretty fast, but Colin had to Colin, so he found himself slapped with another charge of demanding with menace, or extortion, and found himself sentenced to another 18 months in prison. He was charged with another count of robbery in 1980, which landed him an additional 2 years, of which he again only served a year. Around 1981, after being rejected from the French Foreign Legion due to his criminal record, he became interested in survivalism. He joined a club and attended meetings, often spending weekends with them in the woods learning practical skills. He liked the idea of survival training, but he wasn't exactly all in. When he would get tired of foraging or trying to trap rabbits, he would sneak away to local towns to buy food. He did continue to attend lectures, though, and it was there where he met 36-year-old Virginia Zamet. Zamet, Janet, I love you. Virginia was left wheelchair-bound after being paralyzed from the waist down in a car accident when she was 24. She had previously been an avid outdoor enthusiast. The two began a relationship and were married in 1982. Virginia worked as an elementary school teacher. Colin started volunteering at her school, helping children learn to read. He loved her 5-year-old daughter and treated her as if she were his own. They lived in a nice working-class area called Holloway. It seemed Colin was finally turning his life around. The honeymoon phase was over just as quickly as it began. In 1985, Colin was once again arrested for going equipped to cheat, which according to the Oxford reference means one is found in possession of articles to use in the course of or in connection with a burglary. For this, he was given 6 months in prison. His once gentle behavior had started to become aggressive. Then, in 1987, Virginia found out that Colin was having an affair, and the two divorced. Colin hopped around from job to job, from working as a volunteer firefighter to being a chef and even a bouncer at a few different bars, a job which was well suited for the 6-foot-tall man who was described as well-built. In August of 1989, he met Janet Young, who worked at a bar inside of the Globe Inn in the small town of Devon. He approached the bar and asked her if they had any rooms available. The two struck up a conversation and quickly began dating. He soon moved in and began working around the bar. After 3 months, he asked Janet to marry him. Damn it, Janet, I love you. They had a small wedding in December of 1989. Her children adored him, and by all accounts, he was a wonderful stepfather. 4 months into the marriage, Colin drove Janet and her children to her mother's house for a visit for the weekend. When it came time for him to pick them up on Sunday, he never showed. Worried, she called the Globe to check in. She was crushed when she found out that he had emptied many of her things from the apartment, telling one of the other bartenders that he was moving her possessions because they were threatening to be repossessed to pay off her debts. Janet knew that there was no debt or threat of repossession. The bartender, having no idea, had believed him and let him carry on. Little did they know, not only had he stolen most of her belongings, but he had also drained her bank account. He robbed her of everything and simply took off. She wouldn't see him again until years later, when his face was plastered across the front pages of papers and news reports. After the heartless robbery, Colin moved to Southend-on-Sea. He was homeless for a time and again picked up odd jobs. In early 1992, he began working in a homeless shelter. Manager Richard Higgs said that he was a competent and effective worker, though he could be moody at times. I mean, can't we all? Colin would make strange statements from time to time, but he'd also told Richard about his early life, so he assumed Colin was just a bit off. In December of 1992, Richard started getting complaints that Colin was groping female residents. The complaints didn't come from residents, though. They came from other staff members. Richard had always felt Colin got along well with the other residents, but the complaints could not be ignored, so Colin was let go. Colin was now living in a room, which was a step up from his previous situation of being homeless. He was working another menial job that he made no secret of disliking. Everything Colin had done thus far had been a failure, and he was at rock bottom. after a lonely Christmas in his room, unhappy with his life and his failures, that he also failed to realize were at his own doing, he decided that if he couldn't be successful, he'd become notorious. This is when he made a New Year's resolution that came with deadly consequences. It was not until 1967 that the Sexual Offenses Act decriminalized consensual sex between two men in private over the age of 21, which is 5 years higher than the age of consent for heterosexual couples. The clauses in the act still made it possible for people to be prosecuted if more than two people were involved in the act, or even if the act took place in a hotel, not a private residence. It was a small step forward, but many in the legal system still disapproved of and had clear bias against the gay community. Because of the clauses making it easier for gay men to be arrested, and law enforcement's well-known stance of disapproval, most gay men distrusted and feared the police and were very reluctant to speak with them. In 1993, BDSM was still a crime. In fact, the day after Peter Walker's murder, the Law Lords, which was UK's highest court at the time, had upheld a law that consensual BDSM activity was illegal. Those in the leather and BDSM subculture were more likely to be subjected to violence, including being killed. But many officers had a distaste for the lifestyle and put very little, if any, effort into investigating crimes against them. One of Colin's previous jobs was as a bouncer at a gay club, which gave him insight and understanding of the different gay subcultures. Coupled with his hatred for gay men, who Colin would often say he didn't like and call them disgusting, he found the perfect target. Men who would be willing to be tied up, giving him an advantage, and a community who were too scared to speak out. The Coleherne, located in London's Earl Court district, was a known gay bar. It was frequented by many, even hosting Queen frontman Freddie Mercury on one occasion. The bar catered to a variety of clients, many of whom were in the S&M scene. Men had a system of wearing different colored handkerchiefs in their back pockets to indicate what they were looking for in a partner. Colin, knowing this, would blend in seamlessly. After spending months reading books about serial killers, including Robert Russler's Whoever Fights Monsters, and watching TV shows like ITV's The Bill, he would take note of how killers would get caught. He would later tell police that they should, quote, ban that show because of what he was able to learn not to do. Armed with this knowledge, he went to the Coleherne on March 8, 1993. He told himself that if no one approached him, he probably wouldn't do anything. But if someone did, well... News of Peter's death hit the media, though not as widespread as Colin would have liked, but he still decided to lay low for a couple of weeks. He didn't return to the Coleherne until March 28, 1993, where he met 37-year-old librarian Christopher Dunn. The two got to talking and decided to go back to Christopher's flat in North London. Colin came prepared with handcuffs, a small torch, a flashlight, a knife, and a multi-tool. As would later be discovered in interviews, he did the same thing with Christopher as he had done with Peter. He tortured the man for his bank card and PIN number before strangling him, and then proceeded to stay in the man's flat until morning. On March 30th, Christopher was supposed to meet with a friend. When his friend never heard from him, he decided to go check on him. He opened the door to Christopher's home and immediately backed out and called 999. When investigators arrived, they found him naked, in a leather harness, gagged. There were burn marks on his testicles and lash marks on his abdomen and chest. The police decided that there were no signs of foul play, though. It was a different team of investigators, so they didn't link the similarities to Peter's murder and concluded that it was just a sex game gone wrong and ruled an accidental death. Only 6 days later, on June 4th, Colin returned to his hunting ground. On this night, he met 35-year-old Perry Bradley III. Perry was an American from Texas. His father was a successful fundraiser for the Democratic Party. He had a privileged upbringing, but in a conservative Texas society, he had kept his sexuality to himself. After college, he got a job at J.D. Weld and was eventually promoted to the international sales director position, which meant he spent a lot of time in the UK and had a home in Kensington. Perry and Colin met and, again, hit it off. The two went back to Perry's to make an evening of it. Perry wasn't interested in the bondage aspect of things, but Colin talked him into it, saying that he couldn't become aroused without it. Perry reluctantly agreed. Once Colin had him tied up, he proceeded to demand all of his money, as well as his bank card and PIN number. Unlike the previous victims, Colin didn't have to torture Perry. He was wealthy and knew that the threat of being robbed was ever present. He cooperated and gave Colin everything he wanted. At some point, while still tied up on the bed, Peter fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, likely assuming this deranged man would leave once he'd gotten everything he wanted. Sadly, that was not the case. After he'd fallen asleep, Colin placed the noose around his neck and strangled him to death in the early morning hours of June 5th. June 7th was one of the 5 hottest days that summer, and the other residents of the Kensington apartment building started to notice a strange smell coming from the American man's flat. They rang the bell but got no answer, so they decided it was best to call police. The police immediately knew that this man had been murdered, but, like Peter's murder, the scene had been wiped down. Police had no hair, no fingerprints, blood, semen, not even a fiber to work with, and they were frustrated with the lack of leads. Not to mention that this was yet another set of investigators, so it was not connected to Peter's murder, and Perry's death was still considered to be an accidental death, so the 3 were not linked. Colin was also growing frustrated. He wanted to be famous. He wanted his name to be known. He wanted news of his crimes to be on every headline and at the top of every nightly news program. But there was nothing. On June 7th, 1993, the same day the detectives found Perry's body, Colin was feeling confident and made his way back to the Coleherne. He met 33-year-old Andrew Collier. Andrew had an apartment in a housing complex for retirees where he worked as a caretaker. They went back to his flat, which was small and tidy. Things moved to the bedroom where Colin handcuffed him and tied him down with restraints. Again, instead of moving forward, things took a turn. Colin asked for his bank card and PIN number. He used his favorite method of torture by getting him to talk by burning his testicles with a lighter. He would later tell police that to keep neighbors from hearing, he muffled the man's screams by shoving his face in a pillow. While searching Andrew's home, Colin found his HIV medication. This enraged him, and he turned it to the most heartbreaking of places. Warning, this is going to be very awful. He grabbed Andrew's cat, Millie, and strangled her in front of the helpless man. No one paid much attention to Andrew not being at work the next day. They figured he'd just taken the day off. Besides, it was another record-breaking day for the heat, so who would want to be working outside? By June 9th, however, people passing the door in the hall couldn't help but notice the smell, so they called the police. When the police arrived, they were barely through the door when they concluded that the man inside was dead. The smell of decomposition was unmistakable. Once inside the bedroom, though, the patrol officers were so horrified that they immediately backed out and radioed for homicide detectives. Detective Albert Patrick found a brutal scene. Andrew was on his back, wrists, ankles, and neck swollen and bearing ligature marks. His testicles had been burned, and there were marks on his chest where the assailant had put lit cigarettes out on his body. And most gruesomely, his cat's body had been stretched over his chest. Her mouth had been placed closed around Andrew's penis, and a condom had been put on her tail, with her tail being placed into Andrew's mouth. Though horrified by what they had just seen and unaware of the other murders, Detective Patrick knew instantly that this kind of ritualistic killing could not be a one-off. He suspected that a serial killer was behind this. He assigned an officer to contact every criminal investigation department in London to find out if there had been any similar murders in the area. While investigators were putting the pieces together, Colin's impatience got the best of him. Colin called police and wanted to know why they'd stopped investigating Peter Walker's death. He spoke with Detective Gareth Barlow, who first thought it was a prank call. He recalls that the man on the other end was unnervingly calm as he told him he was a serial killer and then gave specific details about Andrew's murder and how he had posed the body with the cat. This information hadn't hit the media, so Detective Barlow immediately switched gears, taking this seriously and taking notes on what the caller had said. Over the next hour, Colin made 3 more calls, each to the departments investigating the killings of one of his victims. Each time, he stoically gave the names and addresses of the victims, as well as details that only the killer would know. He then demanded to know why they hadn't connected the crimes. "You're giving off needy vibes, Colin." One of the officers taking the call was able to get him talking a bit. When asked why he was doing this, he said he'd read a lot of books about serial killers and wanted to know if it could actually be done and gotten away with. When asked why he was targeting gay men, he said, quote, "They keep their mouths shut. They don't tell police things. And they're despicable. And I don't like them." He told police he would keep going until they caught him. This confirmed Detective Patrick's notion that they were indeed dealing with a serial killer, so they began working with the media to get the word out. When 41-year-old Emmanuel Spiteri left for the Coleherne on June 12th, news media outlets had not yet broken the news of a serial killer targeting gay men in London. Colin met him again at the Coleherne. He was approached by the man he had seen in the bar a few times. The two chatted about soccer, the weather, the war in Bosnia, and even talked about the murders of Walker and Collier and the disappearance of Dunn. Once they were back at Emmanuel's home in southeast London and Colin had him handcuffed, reality set in that he was staring at the man who wasn't cruising at the Coleherne, he was hunting. Colin again demanded his money, bank card, and PIN number. When he refused, Colin tortured him. He would later say this murder was more muscle memory than anything. He slipped a noose over Emmanuel's neck and tightened. But this time, inspiration struck after the fact. Colin was going to change things up a bit. He was going to burn the house down. He heaped Emmanuel's furniture and a few of his other belongings into the middle of the living room and set them on fire before leaving. He was quite the failure as an arsonist, as the fire didn't cause any serious damage. Neighbors hadn't even reported smelling smoke. He called police again on June 13th to tell them about his newest murder. He said that they needed to be looking for a corpse inside of a house fire. He must have really wanted people to know he was a reader, because once again he was telling them that he had read books about serial killers and wanted to see if it was possible to get away with a string of murders. I would like to know what books he was reading, because most of them get fucking caught, genius. Anywho, he yet again stated that he targeted gay men because they wouldn't speak to police and because he didn't like them. Change the tape, Teddy Ruxpin. This time, he changed his mind, saying that now that he'd proven to himself he could get away with the murders, they likely wouldn't be hearing from him again. Though he didn't get the publicity he craved after the first few murders, the media exploded after the discovery of Emmanuel Spiteri's body. A midnight press conference was held to announce the discovery of a fifth victim in the string of recent murders targeting gay men. They wanted the community to be on alert and know that they were in danger. The timing of the conference being held at midnight was very intentional. They were hoping that if the killer was with his next victim while the broadcast was on, it would scare the killer off or the victim away before he could be subdued and possibly save a life. At the London Pride Festival, thousands of leaflets were passed out warning everyone about the killer and looking for any information someone may have about who the killer might be. It paid off. A young man who hadn't yet come out to his family bravely came forward to say that he had seen Emmanuel Spiteri getting on the train with a man that night, a big man. He was able to give a pretty accurate description of Colin. They tracked down CCTV footage from the Charing Cross station where the two were spotted. Police combed through 450 hours of footage, but they were finally rewarded when they were able to get several clear frames with the suspect's face fully visible. On July 2nd, they held another press conference urging the killer to come forward and plastering Colin's face across the screen. Colin was rattled. He was a pretty recognizable dude, and he knew it was only a matter of time before someone reported his name. He thought out his next move and decided that the only thing left he could do was to go to a solicitor's office and make a sworn statement, which he did on July 19th. His statement was that he did meet Emmanuel Spiteri at the Coleherne and had gone home with him that evening. He stated that once they arrived, there was a third man inside the house, and he wasn't interested, so he left. He said he slept in a churchyard that night and went home the next day. Police were not interested in verifying his story about the third man or the sleeping in the churchyard. They only wanted his fingerprints. He couldn't back out now, but he knew he'd been careful, so he agreed to the request. 2 days later, he was arrested on suspicion of murder. What Colin didn't know is that police had found a fingerprint in Andrew Collier's apartment. Mr. Thorough wasn't quite as thorough as he thought. The fingerprint and CCTV footage were enough. He was charged with the 2 murders they could connect him to, Andrew Collier and Emmanuel Spiteri. Even with the evidence linking him, he denied the murders. He maintained this stance, but he was incarcerated and police were continuing their investigation. Something changed in him, though, and on August 19th, he called for the guard and asked to speak to a detective saying, "I am the gay serial killer. Tell the police I want to confess." In interrogation, he confessed everything and said he wanted to plead guilty. He said he should be put in a position where he could no longer harm anyone. His confession was detailed and calm. He told police about what he kept in his kill kit: gloves, a flashlight, cheap handcuffs, a common brand of rope, and a spare set of clothing and shoes. After each murder, he would change clothes and shoes and dispose of everything he'd worn during the murder. He would also take anything he may have touched before putting the gloves on, like dishes from Perry Bradley's house, because the two had shared a meal. He disposed of things by tossing them out the window of a train. He stated that he stayed with the bodies overnight because neighbors might find someone leaving in the middle of the night suspicious. He did not boast about his crimes, but he showed absolutely no remorse. He said the only thing that bothered him about the crimes was having to sit with the bodies overnight. Oh, boo fucking who? Maybe you shouldn't have, killed people? Since he pled guilty, there would be no trial. His sentencing hearing lasted 2 hours. To be on the safe side, he was seen by 2 separate psychiatrists who agreed that he was indeed sane and aware of his actions and the consequences of them. Judge Sachs called him an exceptionally frightening and dangerous man and branded his actions pure carnage. On December 20th, 1993, Colin Ireland was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of release. His mother sobbed while his stepfather told reporters outside that the sentence was justified. On February 11, 2012, while incarcerated at Wakefield Prison, he fell and broke his hip. Only 10 days later, he was found dead on the floor of his cell from a combination of the fractured pelvis and pulmonary thrombosis. I really hope it fucking hurt. He wanted to be famous for being a serial killer. He wanted the world to know his name as a force to be reckoned with. Hate to tell you, but you failed at that too, Colin. If you're famous for anything, it's for being a little bitch. You hunted men in a space where they felt safe. You hunted a vulnerable population who was scared to speak out. You waited until they were tied up in what they thought was going to be a consensual act before you carried out your deranged and brutal attacks. The only appropriate title for you is a little bitch. Rest in distress, asshole. And that, my friends, is the case of Colin Ireland, also known as the Gay Slayer. That's it for today, my guys, gals, non-binary pals. Don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss an episode, like next week when we'll look into the case of a young couple who were killed by someone shockingly close to home. If you're liking the podcast, please drop a 5-star wherever you're listening. It really helps the show. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Criminally Nerdy Podcast, Twitter, X, whatever, at Crime Nerd Pod, or shoot me an email anytime at criminallynerdypodcast@gmail.com. Till next time. Keep it nerdy. Freezing. Candied? What? This dude's a fucking loser. Oliver! Fuck. Do you want ants? 'Cause that's how we get ants. Ew. God, I don't want to say this. Are you a bad reader or a bad writer or both? Fucking both. Doped. Shit, that's bad. Please, sir, I'd like some more. Very, 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 very. Dob. Da-da-da-da-da. That's fucking terrible. Son of a bitch. I can't. This is bad. Motherfucker. Barstool? Avon calling. No. Peary? Lana! He remembers me!